That bottle of honey in your kitchen might be one of the easiest foods in the world to fake. Not because nobody knows fraud exists, but because by the time honey is blended, filtered, imported, relabeled, and tested with the wrong method, it can still look completely normal sitting on a grocery shelf. And later in this video, I'm going to show you the most absurd sign that this problem got out of hand. Here is the whole story in one sentence. The honey scam survives because the incentives are huge, the labels are vague, and the testing still has blind spots. Here is the scale of it. World honey production reached 1.894 million tons in 2023. The United States imported a record 562 million pounds of honey in 2024. That represented roughly 76% of the country's honey supply. Domestic production fell to just 116 million pounds in 2025. And in Europe, 147 out of 320 sampled import shipments were flagged as suspicious. This is not some tiny artisan food problem. This is industrial scale. Start with the simplest question. What is honey supposed to be? The Food and Drug Administration says honey is the sweet substance bees make from plant nectar or plant secretions and store in honeycombs. If somebody adds cheaper sweeteners, such as cane syrup, corn syrup, rice syrup, or sugar beet syrup, that product is supposed to be labeled as a blend rather than simply honey, and it should include an ingredient statement. That sounds reassuring until you realize that much of the guidance people point to is exactly that. Guidance. Guidance matters, but it is not the same thing as a binding regulation. In other words, shoppers are being asked to trust a product category where the definitions sound simple, but the real supply chain is anything but simple. Then there is the question of origin. The United States Department of Agriculture says packaged honey must declare one or more countries of origin. One or more. That means a jar can be legally labeled and still tell you very little about what happened between the hive and the bottle. Was it sourced from one place or many places? Was it blended? Was it filtered so aggressively that some of honey's natural fingerprints disappeared? Legally, the label may satisfy the requirements. For an ordinary shopper, it can still leave a lot of unanswered questions. That gray area is where trust starts to break down. So why would anyone tamper with honey in the first place? Because the economics are almost unbelievable. During a major European Union honey authenticity investigation, imported honey averaged about 2.32 euros per kilogram. Rice syrup could be purchased for roughly 0.4 to 0.6 euros per kilogram. That is not a small difference. That is the kind of price gap that turns a food into a fraud magnet. Once you combine that price gap with a United States market that now relies heavily on imported honey, the temptation becomes even greater. Fraud does not require every jar to be fake. It only requires the profit from cheating to be greater than the risk of getting caught. And this is where the story gets worse. Most grocery store fraud does not happen at the bottle stage. It happens upstream. It happens in drums. It happens in shipping containers. It happens in blending tanks. It happens in paperwork. And if that sounds dramatic, wait until you hear some of the customs cases, because some of them sound less like food labeling disputes and more like organized import deception. One of the largest United States honey cases exploded in 2013 when the Department of Justice alleged that honey originating in China had been mislabeled as coming from other countries to avoid anti-dumping duties. Prosecutors said the broader scheme avoided more than $180 million in duties. In the same enforcement effort, a Texas broker was sentenced for helping move 778 container loads of Chinese honey that had been falsely declared as originating in India or Malaysia. Authorities said that scheme avoided nearly $38 million in duties. Some honey involved in the wider investigation was also linked to antibiotics that were not approved for use in honey. So when people hear the phrase honey fraud and imagine someone pouring corn syrup into a jar, the reality can be much larger. Sometimes the fraud involves country laundering, manipulated documentation, and enormous import incentives. To be clear, this does not mean all imported honey is fraudulent. What it means is that the global honey trade has already produced enough documented deception that country of origin itself became part of the scam. That matters because most shoppers assume the label tells the whole story. In some fraud cases, the label was the story being manipulated. And that leads to an obvious question. If the supply chain is this messy, why does testing not solve the problem? This is the part almost nobody talks about. The fraud adapted to the test. Older authenticity methods were very good at identifying syrups derived from corn and sugarcane because those plants leave distinctive isotopic signatures. But researchers at the Joint Research Center found that suspicious honey increasingly appeared to contain syrups derived from rice, wheat, and sugar beet instead. The same report explained that one commonly used stable isotope method could detect corn or sugarcane syrup at concentrations above 1%. For rice, wheat, and sugar beet syrups, that same approach generally became reliable only above 10% unless additional analytical methods were used. The European Commission warned that fraudsters appeared to be adjusting adulteration levels based on what available tests could actually detect. Now consider the United States side of the story. The Food and Drug Administration has acknowledged that its current testing approach detects only a subset of undeclared sweeteners. That single statement helps explain why this issue feels so slippery. The agency found violations in 10% of imported honey samples during one assignment period, 3% during another, and approximately 4% in later domestic and imported sampling. Meanwhile, a European Union investigation flagged 46% of sampled import consignments as suspicious. Those numbers are not directly comparable. The samples were different. The testing methods were different. The legal standards were different. But that is exactly the point. If one testing system clears a jar that another testing system would flag, what exactly did the consumer buy? Authentic honey or honey optimized to pass a weaker test? That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the testing gap that regulators and beekeepers themselves have been discussing. Then there is pollen. It sounds like a tiny detail, until you realize it can function like a fingerprint. Scientists have long used pollen analysis to help verify the floral source of honey, and in many cases, its geographic origin as well. The United States Department of Agriculture notes that raw honey may contain pollen grains. Unfiltered honey may retain them, and filtered honey can have most or all pollen removed. Filtering can improve appearance and consistency. But heavily filtered honey may also lose one of the most useful natural clues we have for determining where it came from. This is where the phrase ultra-filtered starts to become controversial. The phrase is often used as if it describes a premium feature. The real issue is traceability. If pollen is one of the classic tools used to verify origin, then removing it may leave the product cleaner and more uniform, while making it harder to investigate. Heavy filtration alone is not proof of fraud, but if the fingerprint disappears and consumers are asked to rely entirely on paperwork, the obvious question becomes whether that is transparent enough, legally, perhaps. For many consumers, the debate remains unsettled. This helps explain why real honey can feel increasingly rare, even when store shelves remain full. The United States has imported more honey than it produces. Since 2005, imports reached 562 million pounds in 2024. Domestic production fell to 116 million pounds in 2025. When a market depends this heavily on a complex international supply chain, authenticity stops being a simple ingredient question and becomes a traceability question. Real honey may still be inside the jar. Real certainty is much harder to buy. And now, we arrive at the reveal I promised at the beginning. In 2025, the World Beekeeping Awards, organized by Apimondia, removed honey as a judged category. Their explanation was remarkably blunt. Organizers said honey could not be fully tested for adulteration well enough to support fair competition judging. Think about that for a moment. One of the world's largest beekeeping gatherings effectively concluded that authentication challenges had become serious enough that they were no longer comfortable awarding a Best Honey Prize. That is how deep the trust problem has become. So after hearing all of this, the obvious question is how much of the honey on grocery store shelves is actually fake? The uncomfortable answer is that nobody can give you a perfect number. Not regulators, not beekeepers, not even some of the laboratories doing the testing. That does not mean every bottle is fraudulent, but it does mean the old assumption that if it says honey, it must be honey is no longer good enough. The real scam may be that consumers are being asked to trust a product whose authenticity often depends on invisible laboratory methods, hidden blending practices, missing pollen, and paperwork they never get to see. Europe has already strengthened honey blend labeling requirements so that percentages of origin must appear on labels when the updated rules take effect. That tells you how serious the traceability problem became. So, here's the question I want you to think about. If your honey passed one test, failed another, and revealed almost nothing on the label beyond the word honey, would you still trust it? Take a look at the bottle in your kitchen. Check the country of origin. Look for the floral source. Look for anything that makes that jar less anonymous. Then tell me in the comments exactly what your label says. Because once you understand how this supply chain works, that little bottle starts to look very different.